In 1965, a man named Arthur Pemberton in Stoke-on-Trent spent a Saturday morning underneath his Austin A40 with a Haynes manual, a socket set, and a cardboard box to catch the oil, replacing the big end bearings that had started to knock during the previous week's driving. He had never been trained as a mechanic. He had learned from his father, who had learned from a friend, who had learned by doing. By lunchtime, the car was running smoothly. He had spent 12 shillings on parts, and he had not paid a single penny to a garage. His wife, Margaret, was in the kitchen while he worked, cutting a pattern for a dress from a length of fabric that had cost 4 shillings at the market, using a paper pattern she had made herself from measurements taken the previous week. Neither of them thought of what they were doing as remarkable. Number 15 on this list was possessed by virtually every woman in working class and lower middle class Europe until the late 1970s, and has now disappeared so completely that most women under 40 cannot perform even the simplest version of it. Number 8 was a skill that every man who owned a car in Britain, France, and Germany considered as natural and necessary as knowing how to drive the vehicle itself, and its loss has transferred billions of pounds per year from the pockets of car owners to the accounts of main dealer garages that would not have existed in anything like their current form if the skill had survived. And number 1, the skill at the very top of this list was not a technical accomplishment or a domestic art. It was the fundamental competence of adult life in post-war Europe, possessed without exception by every functioning household, and its disappearance has changed the economics of daily life in ways that no one has fully measured. These are 20 skills that European grandparents had, that nobody has anymore, practiced in the kitchens, garages, sheds, and back gardens of working class and lower middle class Britain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands between 1945 and 1985, before the convenience economy, the planned obsolescence of consumer goods, and the professionalization of every practical task conspired to make the skilled layperson feel both unnecessary and incompetent. Before we begin, hit that subscribe button, because what Arthur and Margaret Pemberton knew how to do on that Saturday morning in 1965 represented not just a set of techniques, but a relationship with the physical world that the modern consumer economy has systematically dismantled. Let us count them down. Number 20, bread making. The woman who made bread in the working-class European household of the 1950s and 1960s was not a hobbyist or a food enthusiast. She was a domestic manufacturer who understood, through accumulated practice rather than recipe, the feel of correctly proved dough under her hands, the smell of yeast working properly in a warm kitchen, and the sound of a correctly baked loaf when tapped on its base. A working-class woman in Britain in the late 1950s who baked her own bread twice per week was producing food that cost roughly a quarter of the price of the equivalent shop-bought loaf, and the quality of freshly baked bread, still warm from the oven, was incomparably superior to anything that came wrapped in waxed paper from the bakers. The skill was transmitted from mother to daughter as naturally as the knowledge of how to make a pot of tea. When the sliced white loaf from large commercial bakeries became cheap and ubiquitous in the 1960s and 1970s, and when the pace of domestic life accelerated to the point where 2 hours of bread making felt like an unaffordable luxury, the domestic bread baker retreated from the everyday to the occasional, and the skill withered in a single generation. Number 19, cutting and setting hair at home. Before affordable hairdressing salons reached every high street, and for many years after they did, the ability to cut and set hair within the household was a standard domestic skill possessed by most women and a significant number of men. A mother who cut her children's hair, set her own hair with rollers and setting lotion, and trimmed her husband's hair between barber visits, was saving between £1 and £3 per month on hairdressing costs in the 1960s and 1970s, a meaningful sum. The skill required scissors, a comb, a good pair of hands, and the confidence to make the first cut, learned by watching and being watched in the way that all the skills on this list were learned. Number 18, preserving and potting. The preservation of summer surplus for winter consumption, the making of jam and chutney and pickle and bottled fruit, was a universal domestic skill in working-class European households from the mid-Victorian era through to the 1970s. A woman who made 30 pounds of strawberry jam in July from fruit purchased at the pick-your-own field at 1 shilling per pound was producing a product that cost her roughly a third of the shop price. The skill required knowledge of the setting point of jam, recognizable from the way the jam sheeted off a cold spoon, and the correct method of sealing a jar to prevent contamination, knowledge that was transmitted practically from mother to daughter and is now largely absent from the domestic repertoire of people under 50. Number 17. Basic electrical wiring and fuse repair. The man who could replace a blown fuse, wire a plug, and change a light fitting without calling an electrician was saving between £1 and £3 per call-out in the 1970s, a genuine household saving across a year. The knowledge required was genuinely modest. The colors of the wires, the correct amperage of fuse for each circuit, and the safe procedure for isolating the circuit before working on it. It was taught by fathers to sons as a matter of basic household competence and was possessed by a substantial majority of working-class and lower-middle-class men in Britain and across Northern Europe in the 1960s and 1970s. When electrical safety regulations tightened through the 1990s, the habit of doing one's own wiring retreated, though in most simple domestic situations the skill remains both legal and safe. Number 16. Knitting and crochet. The knitting that was a standard domestic skill for women across working-class Europe through the 1970s was not the fashionable craft hobby it has since become. It was a productive manufacturing activity that produced woolen garments of genuine quality at roughly a third of the cost of equivalent shop-bought knitwear. A woman who knitted her children's jumpers, her husband's socks, and her own cardigans was producing garments at a material cost of between 30 and 50% of the retail equivalent, using time that could be occupied while watching television or sitting in conversation. When machine-knitted synthetic garments became cheap enough in the late 1970s that the time cost of hand knitting exceeded the financial saving, the economic justification for the skill declined, but the decline was faster than the economics alone would have predicted, suggesting that the cultural transmission of the skill had already begun to break down before the economic argument shifted. Number 15. Dressmaking and garment alteration. Margaret Pemberton, cutting her dress pattern in 1965, was performing a skill so common among working-class and lower-middle-class women of her generation that its absence today requires explanation. A woman competent with a sewing machine could make a dress for between a third and a half of the cost of an equivalent shop-bought garment, alter a purchased garment that did not fit perfectly, convert an adult garment that had passed its useful life into a child's garment, and repair rather than replace any item of clothing that developed a fault short of total destruction. The sewing machine in the front room was not a hobby item. It was a productive asset whose economic output in saved clothing costs over a decade could be measured in real pounds that would otherwise have left the household. First pattern break. Here is where things get interesting. Because the skills described so far have all been primarily associated with women's domestic work. But the next entries describe the skills equally distributed between men and women, or primarily associated with men's practical work in the home and on the vehicle, whose loss from the adult repertoire has transferred an equivalent amount of household expenditure from the family budget to the professional service economy. Number 14. Car maintenance and basic mechanical repair. Arthur Pemberton, replacing his big end bearings, was at the extreme end of the domestic mechanical skill spectrum, but the man who could change his own oil, replace his own brake pads, adjust his own points, change his own tires, and diagnose the difference between a fuel system problem and an ignition problem was representative of a large proportion of male car owners in Britain, France, and Germany in the 1960s and 1970s. The Haynes Workshop Manual, first published in 1965, was designed specifically for this audience. A man who changed his own engine oil in the early 1970s spent between 2 and 4 shillings on oil and a filter and saved between 15 and 25 shillings of garage labor charges. Across a year of regular maintenance, the saving was between 10 and 20 pounds. When electronic engine management systems made amateur diagnosis impossible without specialized equipment, and when sealed engine units made routine maintenance tasks impractical without professional tooling, the practical car maintainer lost both the means and the habit. Number 13. Plastering and basic building work. The man who could patch a plaster wall, fill a crack in the ceiling, retile a bathroom, or repoint an external brick course was saving between 2 and 5 pounds per job in the 1970s on work that required no professional qualification and relatively modest technical knowledge. The skills were transmitted through observation and practice, through watching a professional work on one occasion and then doing the next job oneself, and through the network of mutual assistance between neighbors who each had slightly different practical competencies. Number 12. Home brewing and winemaking. The home brewing of beer and the making of wine from fruit, flowers, vegetables, and commercial grape concentrates were common domestic skills in working-class and lower-middle-class Britain, France, and Germany from the 1950s through to the early 1980s. A man who brewed his own bitter in the 1970s using a simple fermenting bucket and malt extract spent between 40 and 60 pence per gallon on a product that cost between 2 and 3 pounds per gallon at the off-license. A productive home brewer who made 10 gallons per month saved between 15 and 25 pounds per month on alcohol costs. When the real price of commercially produced beer fell through the 1980s and the time investment of home brewing seemed increasingly disproportionate, the practice retreated from the mainstream to the hobbyist minority. Number 11. Basic radio and television repair. The man who could replace a valve in a wireless set, align a television aerial, diagnose a picture fault, and replace a failed component on a printed circuit board was the domestic equivalent of the garage mechanic, and in the 1960s and early 1970s, he was almost as common. The skills required understanding the basic principles of electronics, the ability to read a circuit diagram, and confidence with a soldering iron. When surface-mounted components replaced through-hole components, and when integrated circuits made individual component replacement impractical, the amateur repair route closed, and the professional repairer became the only option. Second pattern break. This next one is where the most personal knowledge lived, because the skills described so far have all been definable and teachable in a relatively formal sense. But the next entries describe a category of practical knowledge that is harder to define because it consists not of specific techniques, but of accumulated judgment, the kind of knowledge that tells you when the yeast is working correctly, when the brickwork needs repointing before the water gets in, when the engine note has changed in a way that means attention is required. This is knowledge acquired only through repeated practice in real conditions over real time, and it is exactly the knowledge that disappears most completely when a skill falls out of daily use. Number 10. Reading weather and seasonal patterns for practical domestic management. The European housewife and farmer of the post-war decades read the sky, the wind direction, and the appearance of plant growth in ways that were directly practical rather than merely observational. She knew that a mackerel sky in September meant rain within 24 hours, and the washing should come in from the line. She knew that runner beans should be picked when they were 6 inches long, or they would become stringy. She knew which combination of conditions produced a good bread rise and which suggested the yeast should be started again. This observational knowledge of the natural world in its domestic application has been replaced by the weather forecast on the telephone and the sell-by date on the packet and the instruction on the seed packet. Number 9. Making do with what was available. The skill of making do, of substituting one ingredient for another, one tool for another, one method for another, when the preferred option was unavailable or unaffordable, was so deeply embedded in the practical repertoire of the post-war household that it barely registered as a skill at all. The housewife who ran out of baking powder and knew that bicarbonate of soda with cream of tartar would serve the same purpose was applying substitution knowledge. The mechanic who needed a specific washer and cut one from a leather bootlace was applying improvisation knowledge. These knowledges are the first thing to disappear when technical skill is replaced by professional service, because the professional has access to the specific material and therefore never needs to improvise. Number 8. Navigating by map and local knowledge. Before the satellite navigation device, the adult who drove a car navigated by reading a paper map, by using physical landmarks, by asking directions from local people and interpreting them, and by maintaining an ongoing spatial model of their journey in relation to the landscape. The map reading skill taught in schools through the 1960s and 1970s required spatial reasoning, the ability to match the two-dimensional representation of the map to the three-dimensional experience of the landscape. When the satellite navigation device made this skill unnecessary, it was the first practical competence to disappear from the adult repertoire in a very long time, and studies of navigation ability have found significant measurable decline in the spatial mapping ability of adults who have used navigation devices habitually compared with those who have not. Number 7. Sharpening and maintaining hand tools. The man whose tools were always sharp was the man whose tools did what they were supposed to do. The ability to sharpen a chisel to the correct angle, to set the teeth of a handsaw, to grind and strop a plain iron to a mirror finish was a prerequisite of competent woodworking. A sharp chisel requires 15 minutes on a sharpening stone and a strop to maintain. A blunt chisel requires more force, produces worse work, and eventually becomes unusable. When the disposable blade replaced the sharpened tool in most practical applications, the sharpening skill became unnecessary and died within a generation. Third pattern break. Here is where the story becomes most personal, because the final entries on this list are not technical skills at all. They are the human competencies that underlie all the other skills on this list, the capacities for patience, for learning through failure, for observation rather than instruction, and for the acceptance of the time that genuine competence requires, that the post-war generation possessed as natural features of adult life, and that the modern world has made progressively more difficult to maintain. Number 6. Writing and reading letters by hand. The adult who could write a clear, properly constructed letter by hand, who knew how to begin and end a formal letter, how to express a complaint effectively in writing, how to describe a technical problem to a tradesman or an official in terms that would result in the required action, was in possession of a communication skill now so rare among working-class adults that it has effectively transferred to the professional and middle classes as a marker of social distinction. When the telephone became universal in British and European homes through the 1970s and 1980s, the letter retreated from everyday use to formal occasions, and the skill deteriorated through disuse. Number 5. Mental arithmetic and household mathematics. The adult who could calculate the change from a 5-pound note without a calculator, who could estimate the quantity of paint needed to cover a room, who could convert a recipe from 4 to 6 portions in their head while standing in the kitchen, was deploying a mathematical competence that required both fluency with number and the confidence to apply it quickly in practical contexts. This was not the mathematics of school examinations, it was the mathematics of daily life, reliable and approximate, rather than precise and anxious. When the pocket calculator arrived in the mid-1970s, and when the cash register in shops began displaying the correct change without the cashier needing to calculate it, the habit of mental calculation began to atrophy. Number 4. The practical first aid and home nursing skill. The post-war European household managed a wider range of medical situations at home than is now considered appropriate. A mother who could identify the signs of impetigo as distinct from eczema, who could pack a wound effectively and judge when professional attention was required, who could manage a child's fever without panic and knew when the temperature warranted a doctor, was deploying clinical judgment that has since been transferred almost entirely to the professional medical system. When the health service became more accessible and cultural norms around home treatment tightened, the practical first aid skill retreated. Number 3. Reading aloud and storytelling. Before the television and the recorded audiobook, the adult who could read aloud with expression and tell a story from memory was providing domestic entertainment that required no equipment, no electricity, and no preparation beyond the knowledge held in the reader's mind. The grandparent who told stories of their own childhood, who read from the newspaper in a voice that made the words come alive, who performed the characters of a favorite children's book with different voices and timed pauses, was practicing a performing art that has been replaced by the screen so completely that the idea of reading aloud as a social activity now seems quaint to most people under 40. Number 2. The skill of patient waiting and a long view. The generation that planted fruit trees they might not live to pick from, that started a savings account, knowing it would take 20 years to produce a useful sum, that began a craft project, knowing it would take 3 months of evenings to complete, was exercising a relationship with time that the modern economy of immediate delivery and instant gratification has made increasingly difficult to maintain. The patient approach to skill acquisition, in which competence was understood as the product of years of practice rather than hours of instruction, was the foundation on which all the other skills on this list rested. You became a good bread maker by making bread for 10 years. You became a competent car mechanic by working on cars for 15 years. Number 1. The confidence to have a go. At the very top of this list sits not a technique or a craft or a practical knowledge. It sits the fundamental disposition of the adult who encountered an unfamiliar task and thought, as a first response rather than a last resort, that they could probably work it out. Arthur Pemberton had never replaced big end bearings before that Saturday morning. He bought the manual, read it the previous evening, gathered the tools, and started work. Margaret Pemberton had never made a dress in exactly that style before. She took her measurements, adapted the pattern, and cut the cloth. The confidence that they brought to those tasks was not arrogance and it was not recklessness. It was the earned confidence of adults who had been tackling unfamiliar tasks since childhood, who had learned that most practical problems yield to patient attention and who understood failure as information rather than defeat. When the professional service economy made it easier to pay someone else than to try oneself, and when the cultural message shifted from have a go to leave it to the expert, the foundational confidence began to erode. What was lost was not just the individual skills on this list. What was lost was the disposition that had produced those skills, the willingness to try, to fail, to try again, and to learn. Your parents and grandparents had that disposition as a natural feature of adult life. They did not think of it as courage. They called it getting on with it. And they were right. The knowledge is still here. They knew. Now you know too.